One day, the person who laughed at your silence will become terrified by it, not because you changed into someone cruel, but because they suddenly realize you were never the weak person they believed they could control. What happens next is something almost no one talks about. The moment a narcissist realizes they misjudged you, their entire psychological strategy begins to collapse. And the signs are impossible to ignore. Have you ever noticed how some people become strangely angry the moment you stop reacting? Write, "I choose myself" in the comments if you've experienced this. By the end of this video, you'll understand why your silence became more powerful than every argument you ever had, and why the person who once saw you as easy to manipulate now sees you as their greatest uncertainty. There comes a moment in many unhealthy relationships when illusion can no longer survive contact with reality. A narcissistic person often forms quick conclusions about others based on what serves their own sense of superiority. If someone is patient, forgiving, empathetic, or willing to give second chances, these qualities are rarely seen as strengths. Instead, they are interpreted as signs of weakness, dependence, or a lack of intelligence. This mistaken judgment becomes the foundation of their behavior. They assume they have accurately measured your character, believing you will always tolerate disrespect, overlook manipulation, or remain emotionally available regardless of how poorly you are treated. In their mind, the story is already written and your role is fixed. What they fail to recognize is that genuine strength often appears quiet rather than dramatic. A person who chooses peace over conflict is not necessarily incapable of confrontation. Someone who listens more than they speak is not lacking awareness. In fact, the most emotionally resilient individuals frequently observe far more than they reveal. They understand that not every battle deserves a response, and that preserving inner stability is often wiser than proving a point. While the narcissistic individual mistakes restraint for submission, they unknowingly overlook the depth of your perception and resilience. The illusion begins to crack when your behavior no longer follows the script they created. You stop explaining yourself endlessly. You stop seeking their approval. Your decisions become guided by self-respect rather than fear of rejection. Suddenly, their familiar methods no longer produce the expected reactions. The emotional leverage they once relied upon starts disappearing, leaving them confused by a version of you they never anticipated. This realization is unsettling because it forces them to confront an uncomfortable possibility. They did not truly understand you. They only understood the image they projected onto you. The person they believed was easy to manipulate was quietly developing clarity, confidence, and emotional independence all along. What seemed like weakness was actually patience. What appeared to be compliance was thoughtful observation. And what they dismissed as simplicity was, in reality, a strength that no longer needs to announce itself to be recognized. The greatest shift in any unhealthy relationship rarely begins with a dramatic confrontation. It begins quietly, within the mind of the person who decides that their worth can no longer depend on another person's approval. Emotional independence is not about becoming cold or detached. It is about reaching a place where your peace is no longer controlled by someone else's opinions, moods, or attempts to manipulate your emotions. This transformation changes the entire balance of power, especially in relationships where control has always been mistaken for connection. A narcissistic person often relies on a predictable cycle. They offer approval when it benefits them, withdraw affection when they want compliance, and create confusion that keeps others seeking reassurance. This pattern works only as long as the other person believes that acceptance must be earned. Every apology, every explanation, and every attempt to prove your intentions feeds the illusion that they remain at the center of your emotional world. As long as your happiness depends on their validation, they believe they hold the advantage. The dynamic begins to unravel when that need quietly disappears. You no longer feel compelled to defend every decision or justify every boundary. Their praise becomes pleasant but unnecessary, while their criticism loses its power to define who you are. Instead of reacting with fear or desperation, you respond with calm confidence. This unexpected change creates uncertainty because the emotional strings they once pulled no longer produce the same response. True emotional independence also changes the way you view yourself. You stop measuring your value through another person's shifting opinions and begin recognizing qualities that have always existed within you. Confidence becomes rooted in character rather than approval. Decisions become guided by personal values instead of the fear of disappointing someone who never intended to be satisfied in the first place. This inner stability cannot be easily manipulated because it comes from self-awareness rather than external praise. For the narcissistic individual, this is deeply unsettling. They realize that the influence they once believed was permanent is fading. The person they expected to remain emotionally dependent has become psychologically free. Without your constant search for their approval, their methods lose effectiveness, and the relationship no longer revolves around their control. In that quiet moment, they begin to understand that your greatest strength was never winning their acceptance. It was discovering that you never truly needed it. Silence is often misunderstood in a world that celebrates the loudest voice. Many people assume that if someone chooses not to argue, defend themselves, or respond to every accusation, they must be afraid or incapable of standing up for themselves. A narcissistic person frequently embraces this assumption. They interpret your silence as surrender, believing that your refusal to engage confirms their superiority. In reality, silence can become one of the strongest expressions of emotional maturity because it refuses to feed the very conflict manipulation depends upon. Every manipulative interaction follows a familiar pattern. A provocative comment is made, an unfair accusation is introduced, a hurtful remark is delivered with the expectation that you will react emotionally. Once you become defensive, the conversation shifts away from truth and toward emotional chaos. Your frustration becomes the focus instead of their behavior. This cycle repeats because every emotional reaction provides another opportunity to maintain psychological control. The moment you stop participating in this pattern, something unexpected happens. Your silence interrupts the script they have relied upon for so long. Instead of offering explanations, you remain composed. Instead of chasing understanding, you protect your peace. Instead of arguing over distorted versions of reality, you recognize that not every accusation deserves an answer. This quiet restraint creates uncertainty because the emotional response they expected never arrives. Silence is not the absence of strength. It is often evidence that strength has become disciplined. It reflects the understanding that your energy is valuable and should not be wasted trying to convince someone who has already decided not to understand you. There is wisdom in recognizing the difference between a conversation that builds mutual respect and an argument designed only to exhaust you. For the narcissistic person, this change can feel deeply unsettling. They begin to realize that the emotional buttons they once pressed so easily no longer produce the same reactions. The person they believed they could provoke at will has become calm, deliberate, and difficult to manipulate. Your silence is no longer interpreted as weakness, but as distance, confidence, and self-control. Without arguments to fuel their sense of influence, they are left confronting something they rarely expect: The realization that genuine power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply walks away from the game without saying a word, leaving manipulation with nothing left to control. Boundaries are often misunderstood as walls meant to push people away, when in reality they are clear expressions of self-respect. They define what you will accept, what you will no longer tolerate, and how you expect to be treated. To a healthy person, boundaries create trust because they encourage honesty and mutual respect. To a narcissistic person, however, boundaries often feel like a direct threat because they limit access to the control they once believed they had. The moment you begin setting healthy limits, hidden intentions that were once carefully disguised begin to reveal themselves. At first, the response may seem subtle. A simple request for respect is met with sarcasm. A reasonable limit is labeled as selfishness. Your decision to say no is treated as betrayal rather than a normal expression of personal choice. These reactions are not random. They expose a difficult truth. Someone who only values you when you have no boundaries may have been benefiting from your lack of them all along. The discomfort they express is often less about your behavior and more about losing the freedom to manipulate it. Many people spend years believing that maintaining peace requires endless compromise. They become accustomed to ignoring their own needs, avoiding conflict, and accepting treatment they would never wish upon someone they love. Over time, this pattern creates the illusion that sacrificing yourself is the price of keeping relationships intact. But genuine relationships do not demand the disappearance of your identity. They allow space for honesty, disagreement, and individual needs without turning those differences into emotional weapons. The moment you begin honoring your own boundaries, something remarkable happens. You start seeing people more clearly than ever before. Those who genuinely care about you may need time to adjust, but they eventually respect your limits because they value the relationship more than their convenience. Those driven by control react very differently. They resist, criticize, pressure, or attempt to make you feel guilty for protecting your peace. In doing so, they unintentionally expose motives that words alone could never reveal. For the narcissistic individual, your boundaries represent something they never expected. They reveal that you are no longer willing to exchange your emotional well-being for temporary approval. The person they believed would always accommodate their demands has become someone who calmly protects their dignity without seeking permission. This quiet transformation is difficult for them to accept because every healthy boundary reminds them that the version of you they once controlled no longer exists. Your limits do not destroy meaningful relationships. They simply reveal which ones were built on respect and which ones depended on your silence. Self-awareness is one of the most powerful forms of protection a person can develop because it changes the way manipulation is received. A narcissistic person often succeeds by exploiting emotional blind spots rather than obvious weaknesses. They pay attention to your fears, your need for approval, your guilt, and your unresolved wounds. These become the emotional hooks they rely on to influence your decisions. As long as you remain unaware of these patterns, you are more likely to question yourself instead of questioning the behavior directed toward you. But the moment you begin understanding your own mind, those hidden vulnerabilities gradually lose their power. This process rarely happens overnight. It begins with small moments of reflection. You start asking yourself why certain words affect you so deeply. You notice recurring situations where you apologize even when you have done nothing wrong. You begin recognizing how easily guilt has influenced your choices in the past. Instead of reacting automatically, you become curious about your emotional responses. That curiosity slowly transforms into clarity, and clarity becomes the foundation of emotional freedom. A narcissistic person depends on confusion. They benefit when you doubt your memory, second-guess your instincts, or believe that your feelings are always the problem. They encourage uncertainty because a confused person is easier to control than a confident one. However, self-awareness interrupts this pattern. You become familiar with your values, your emotional triggers, and your personal boundaries. When manipulation appears, it no longer feels mysterious. You recognize it for what it is rather than accepting it as your responsibility to fix. As your awareness grows, your reactions begin to change. You no longer rush to defend yourself against every accusation. You stop carrying blame that does not belong to you. Instead of seeking constant reassurance, you trust your own observations. This quiet confidence cannot be easily shaken because it is built on honest self-understanding rather than external validation. You are no longer searching for someone else to define your reality because you have learned to recognize it for yourself. For the narcissistic individual, this transformation is deeply frustrating. Their familiar tactics begin losing effectiveness because the emotional buttons they once pressed no longer produce the same response. The guilt they tried to create no longer controls your decisions. The shame they attempted to place on your shoulders no longer determines your self-worth. The confusion they relied upon begins to disappear. They slowly realize that they are no longer interacting with the uncertain person they once manipulated. They are facing someone who understands themselves too well to surrender their peace for another person's need to remain in control. One of the greatest misunderstandings about narcissistic behavior is the belief that the deepest fear is losing a relationship. While the end of a relationship may certainly affect them, what often creates the greatest discomfort is something far more profound: the loss of psychological control. Control provides a sense of certainty. It allows them to predict your reactions, influence your decisions, and maintain a position where they feel emotionally superior. When that control begins to disappear, they often experience a level of frustration that has little to do with love and everything to do with losing influence over someone they once believed they fully understood. This is why their behavior can become confusing. At times, they seem distant, indifferent, or even relieved when you begin pulling away. Yet the moment you truly stop seeking their approval, they may suddenly become attentive, apologetic, or unexpectedly emotional. These reactions are not always expressions of genuine connection. They often reflect the discomfort of realizing that the familiar patterns no longer work. The person who once responded to guilt, criticism, or emotional pressure has become someone who quietly makes decisions without asking for permission. Healthy love encourages freedom. It allows two people to grow as individuals while supporting one another with trust and respect. It does not require constant monitoring, emotional tests, or subtle attempts to maintain authority. Control, however, functions differently. It depends on uncertainty. It thrives when one person feels responsible for managing another's emotions or constantly worries about keeping the peace. The more emotionally dependent someone becomes, the easier they are to influence. That is why control is often mistaken for closeness, when in reality it slowly replaces it. Everything changes when you begin trusting yourself instead of relying on someone else's approval. You stop explaining every decision. You become comfortable with silence. You no longer feel obligated to rescue every conversation or repair every misunderstanding. These small changes send a powerful message. They reveal that your choices are now guided by self-respect rather than fear. The emotional leverage that once shaped your behavior gradually disappears. For the narcissistic individual, this shift can feel deeply unsettling because it forces them to confront a reality they never expected. They may still have memories, opinions, or assumptions about who you used to be, but they no longer have the influence they once depended upon. The relationship is no longer organized around their need for control. Instead, it revolves around your ability to remain grounded in your own values. In that moment, they begin to realize that what they truly lost was not simply your presence. They lost the certainty that they could control your emotional world. And that is a realization far more difficult for them to accept than the relationship itself. There is a common belief that the greatest form of revenge is making someone suffer the way they made you suffer. It is an idea that promises satisfaction through retaliation, as though pain can be balanced by creating more pain. Yet life often reveals a different truth. The most profound response to betrayal, manipulation, or emotional control is not revenge at all. It is transformation. Nothing unsettles a narcissistic person more than witnessing someone they underestimated become stronger, wiser, and completely independent without seeking recognition or approval from them. Personal transformation begins in places that are invisible to everyone else. It starts when you stop blaming yourself for another person's behavior. It grows when you begin investing your energy in healing instead of replaying painful conversations in your mind. Every healthy habit, every new skill, every moment of self-reflection, and every decision to protect your peace quietly builds a version of yourself that no longer depends on the opinions of those who once tried to diminish you. These changes may seem small at first, but over time they reshape your entire identity. A narcissistic person often expects your life to remain centered around what happened between you. They may assume you will continue seeking answers, carrying resentment, or hoping for validation that never comes. That expectation gives them a sense of importance because it keeps them emotionally present in your world. But genuine growth breaks that connection. Your attention gradually shifts away from the past and toward the future. Instead of asking why they behaved as they did, you begin asking how you can become a healthier, wiser, and more authentic version of yourself. This change is difficult for them to understand because it cannot be controlled. They may notice that you smile more easily, make decisions with confidence, and surround yourself with relationships built on mutual respect rather than emotional dependency. You no longer react to every attempt to provoke you because your focus has moved beyond proving anything to anyone. Your success is no longer measured by whether they acknowledge your worth, but by how fully you recognize it yourself. The greatest transformation is not becoming someone they regret losing. It is becoming someone who no longer measures life through their approval, criticism, or attention. Your peace becomes your victory. Your confidence becomes your answer. Your future becomes more important than your past. In the end, the most powerful response to being underestimated is not making someone witness your pain. It is allowing them to witness a version of you that no longer carries it. That quiet evolution speaks louder than any act of revenge ever could, because true strength is revealed through the life you build, not the battles you choose to continue fighting. There comes a point in every journey of personal growth when the desire to prove yourself begins to fade. In the beginning, it is natural to want others to recognize your value, especially those who underestimated you, dismissed your feelings, or treated your kindness as weakness. Part of you hopes they will finally admit they were wrong. You imagine the satisfaction of seeing them acknowledge your strength and regret the way they judged you. Yet true power emerges the moment you no longer need that recognition to feel complete. A narcissistic person often expects every disagreement to become a competition and every boundary to become a battle. They assume that if you become stronger, you will eventually return seeking revenge, public validation, or an opportunity to prove that you have won. This expectation reflects the way they understand relationships, where worth is measured by dominance and victory belongs to the person who controls the narrative. What they rarely anticipate is someone who quietly walks away from the competition altogether. Real confidence has little interest in constant comparison. It does not require applause, dramatic speeches, or public declarations of success.